In the year 722, the mathematics of war said the result was already decided. A few hundred fugitives in a cave. An imperial army rolling north beneath the banners of the Umayyad Caliphate, the most expansive and efficient military power the Western world had seen since Rome. On paper, this was not a battle. It was cleanup, an administrative act with spears. One more rebellious pocket to be erased from a peninsula that had already fallen. But history does not obey arithmetic when terrain, desperation, and conviction begin working together. That is why Covadonga matters. Not because it was large, not because it was clean, but because it was the moment a global superpower reached into a mountain throat, expecting to crush a cornered animal, and instead found teeth. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to look first at the scale of the world pressing down on northern Iberia. The Umayyad Caliphate was not just another victorious kingdom. By the early 8th century, it stretched from the lands near India, across Arabia, North Africa, and over the Pyrenees. It had swallowed old powers with terrifying speed. Kingdoms that had fought each other for generations now paid taxes to new governors, bowed to new law, and adapted or disappeared. Across most of Iberia, resistance had already collapsed into negotiation, submission, or local accommodation. That is one of the most important truths in the transcript. Logic favored surrender. The empire was too large, too fast, too organized, and too used to success. Against that pressure, Pelayo looked almost ridiculous. He was not a crowned emperor with a treasury and formal army. He was a fugitive noble, a survivor of the wreckage of the old Visigothic order, a man hiding in mountains with followers who were not polished soldiers so much as desperate men refusing to vanish. That refusal is the real beginning of the story. Pelayo did not resist because the odds were good. He resisted because the alternative was extinction of rank memory faith and local freedom all at once. The transcript ties his rebellion to personal humiliation and regional abuse under the governor Munuza, and that matters because great resistance movements often begin where political subjugation becomes intimate. This was not an abstract disagreement over sovereignty. It was occupation brought into the household, into honor, into daily life. Pelayo had already been captured, already pressured, already taught what obedience looked like under the new order. When he escaped and returned to the mountains, he did not come back to negotiate his place. He came back to build a problem. The Umayyad answer was exactly what empires usually produce when defiance emerges at the edge. They escalated, not because Pelayo himself was yet a grand strategic threat, but because examples matter. If one rebel in the north could remain visible and unpunished, others might begin imagining that imperial reach had limits. So an expedition was organized under Alcama, accompanied by Bishop Oppas, whose presence is crucial in the story. Oppas was not just a priest tagging along. He embodied collaboration continuity and the argument that survival meant adapting to the new rulers. He was there to help convert rebellion into surrender before battle became necessary. That tells us something important. The empire still believed this could be resolved by overwhelming prestige. In their minds, Pelayo was not the beginning of a new state. He was an isolated irritant. The army sent against him, whether one accepts the highest chronicler figures or more conservative estimates, was still enormous compared with the roughly 300 men the transcript places in Pelayo's camp. That disproportion is the heart of the legend, but also the heart of the tactical truth. The exact number matters less than the structural fact. Pelayo's force was tiny, hungry, poorly equipped, and completely unable to survive open battle. So he refused open battle. That is the first mark of real command. Pelayo did not confuse bravery with stupidity. On the plain, Umayyad cavalry would erase him in minutes. He needed a battlefield that made most of the enemy irrelevant. This is why Mount Auseva and the Covadonga cave matter so much. The site was not chosen for symbolism first. It was chosen because geography there behaves like a weapon. The valley narrows into a severe gorge. The approach constricts. The Deva River below adds danger to retreat and collapse. The cave itself, dominating the only viable pass, offered natural protection, impossible to reproduce on open ground. Pelayo was not hiding in a hole. He was selecting a machine. He studied the ground the way an engineer studies pressure points. If the Umayyad army could be forced to attack uphill in compressed formation under rock in limited frontage, then its size would stop being an advantage and start becoming a burden. That is one of the deepest lessons of Covadonga. Large armies are powerful only where they can use their size. The men Pelayo placed there were not ideal troops by conventional standards. They were fugitives, mountaineers, poor farmers, local nobles, stripped down to necessity, men with axes, stones, rough spears, hunting bows, and the kind of resolve that comes when retreat has become another name for death. This matters because the script does not romanticize them as polished warriors. Their power came from terrain cohesion, local knowledge, and the emotional condition of people who had already accepted that they might die there. Armies built on pay and imperial routine often struggle against that kind of opponent in bad ground. Not because the cornered men are stronger in absolute terms, but because they are harder to move psychologically once the position convinces them that holding means existence itself. When Alcama arrived and looked up, he believed he had been handed a gift. That is the second major reason the battle unfolds as it does. He misread the position completely. What he saw was not a fortress of resistance, but a trap for the trapped. The rebels had put themselves in a cave. There was no apparent avenue of escape, no room for maneuver, no route for meaningful withdrawal. From his perspective, they had done the imperial work for him by cornering themselves. This kind of misreading is common when commanders let superiority become contempt. The transcript's scene with Bishop Opus brings this out beautifully. He climbs to the mouth of the cave and argues not simply from theology, but from logic. All Spain has fallen. The strong have bent the knee. How can a handful of starving men in a rock cavity hope to stop an empire? Pelayo's answer matters because it is political before it becomes military. He does not ask for mercy. He predicts rebirth. He says, in essence, that out of this mountain will come the salvation of Spain. That response is not useful because it is poetic. It is useful because it tells his own men that survival here is no longer just local self-defense. It has become founding myth before the first strike is launched. Alcama answered with the most straightforward tool available: volume. Archers, slingers, vanguard, infantry, a flood of projectiles meant to sweep the cave mouth clean. In open or moderately inclined terrain, that should have worked. Enough arrows and stones can saturate almost any improvised position. But here the mountain itself intervened. The cave at Covadonga had an outward projecting stone overhang, effectively a natural shield. Projectiles launched from below at a steep, forced angle did not penetrate the space the way the Umayyads expected. Many struck the limestone and rebounded. This detail is central because it turns the first phase of the attack into the beginning of panic. The rain of death that should have exterminated the defenders instead fell back into the tightly packed ranks of the attackers crowding the ascent. Confusion broke the front. Men below were still pushing upward, believing the pressure itself would end resistance. Men ahead were suddenly dodging their own missiles, slipping, shouting, and losing formation in a place too narrow for quick recovery. That was the moment Pelayo had prepared for. The defenders had not relied only on the cave. They had also secured the upper ridges of Mount Auseva, places the Umayyad scouts had failed to control properly. Once the ascent jammed and the front ranks lost clean order, the Asturians began using the oldest and most merciless ally. Mountain warfare offers gravity. Stones, trunks, and loosened masses of debris went crashing down into the compressed attackers. Here, the narrowness of the pass turned from annoyance into death trap. A sword can be answered by another sword. A man in chainmail can survive an arrow or a glancing cut. He cannot stop a heavy rock gaining speed down a steep incline. The first waves of the Umayyad vanguard were crushed, thrown backward, jammed against their own comrades, or hurled into the river below. At exactly the point when the attackers should have been expanding control, they were becoming a human plug. Then Pelayo sent his men out. This is another place where the battle's psychology matters as much as its mechanics. The Asturians did not descend like parade soldiers in neat formation. They came downhill with the kind of ferocity only enclosed positions produce once the enemy visibly loses balance. Momentum is a weapon in such terrain. So is proximity. Long weapons become awkward. Elaborate formation becomes difficult. The Asturians, using short, violent tools and shield force, fought like men who knew every meter of the slope mattered more than any abstract, tactical textbook. They pushed, hacked, slammed, and threw disoriented attackers off ledges and into the gorge. What had begun as an Umayyad advance now turned into a meat grinder powered by the Empire's own inability to deploy its strength. From the rear, Alcama struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. This is one of the most telling lines in the transcript. His military mind, trained on plains and large field maneuver, could not process the collapse. That is exactly the point. The battlefield had been chosen specifically to invalidate the categories in which he understood superiority. He could not feed men effectively into the front. He could not widen the engagement. He could not use cavalry where cavalry mattered. He could not even get clean information because the terrain, the echo, and the congestion turned command into noise. And then, weather joined the defenders. The storm is not just atmospheric drama in this story. It is a force multiplier. Heavy rain and hail turned the paths and slopes into mud and slick clay. Horses lost footing, men fell, armor and equipment became heavier with water and filth. The river below swelled louder. The entire environment shifted from difficult to hostile. This is one reason mountain warfare is so unforgiving to invading armies. Once weather turns against you in constricted terrain, the land stops being a passive setting and starts behaving like another enemy line. Amid that chaos, Alcima exposed himself trying to restore order and was killed. Whether by arrow, stone, or blade matters less than the strategic consequence. The commanding head of the expedition fell inside a battle that had already stopped obeying normal logic. With that, the last thread of cohesion snapped. The retreat that followed was no disciplined withdrawal. It was fear changing direction. Men who had advanced with imperial certainty now turned and ran, trampling each other on the same narrow approaches that had just ruined their offensive. Weapons were dropped, loot abandoned, formations vanished. Some groups fled by the entry route under constant harassment, others trying desperately to escape the cave, and its defenders took the mountain paths toward Kosgaya, assuming that any route away from Pelayo must mean survival. The transcript's account of what followed there is framed almost biblically: rain-saturated ground, overloaded slopes, thousands of exhausted men and horses pressing onto unstable earth, and then a catastrophic landslide burying or carrying off large portions of the retreating force. Whether every medieval detail is literal or amplified through sacred memory, the key meaning is clear. In Christian remembrance, the mountain itself finished the judgment the cave had begun. That matters because Covadonga was never remembered only as a clever ambush. It was remembered as providential topography, land weather, and resistance fused into one act of reversal. Back in the valley, the silence after battle had changed character. The defenders moved among the dead, and the debris recovering armor, swords, horses, and supplies. This is one of the practical consequences often overlooked in legendary retellings. The victory did not merely preserve a tiny rebel band. It transformed its material condition. Men who had fought with improvised and inferior tools suddenly had access to better weapons, mail horses, and equipment captured from one of the world's premier military systems. In a single day, they had not just survived, they had upgraded. That is the beginning of state formation in military form. Victory produces not only morale, but means. And Pelayo understood immediately that survival at Covadonga was not the end of anything. It was time purchased. He had won space prestige and proof, but not security. The Umayyad world remained vast. Another army could in theory come. That is why the transcript is right to emphasize his realism after the battle. He did not descend the mountain pretending the war was over. He consolidated. He established himself in Cangas de Onis. He linked resistance zones through marriage, especially by joining his house to broader northern Christian leadership through the union of his daughter Ermesinda and Alfonso, son of Pedro of Cantabria. This is a crucial move. The rebellion ceased to be a band of fugitives and began becoming a polity. Covadonga therefore matters not just as a battle, but as a political pivot. It gave the northern resistance the credibility needed to become more than a story. The Umayyad side then made the error that shaped centuries. They treated the Asturian nucleus as a nuisance rather than an existential threat. That dismissal is understandable in the short term. Great empires often cannot afford to treat every mountain resistance as the center of history. They had larger fronts, more urgent rebellions, and the normal imperial instinct to assume that tiny, hard places eventually die of isolation. But the North did not die. It hardened. That is the true strategic significance of Covadonga. Not that it immediately reversed the conquest of Iberia. It did not. It created a protected embryo of non-submission that the empire failed to abort when it still could have done so more easily. The transcript then wisely follows that embryo forward. Alfonso I took Pelayo's narrow survival space and began using it offensively. He raided south depopulated zones, pulled Christian populations back north, and created buffer emptiness in front of Asturian power. This is important because it shows the long-term logic that grows out of Covadonga survival in the mountains must be converted into strategic depth. Then later, under Alfonso II, even when Oviedo was burned and the enemy seemed once more overwhelming, the same lesson returned. Cities could be abandoned and rebuilt. Armies in bad terrain could be destroyed permanently. At Lutos, the Asturian kingdom repeated the core principle. Pelayo had first embodied, let the invader stretch burden himself with loot, enter bad ground, and then strike where geography and fatigue do the shaping work. That is when resistance stops being miraculous and becomes doctrine. Then came the ideological masterstroke of Santiago de Compostela. The finding of the tomb of St. James gave the Northern Kingdom not just faith, but status, narrative, and European significance. This matters because no state survives long on battlefield memory alone. It needs legitimacy, powerful enough to attract allies, settlers, clergy, and the imagination of people beyond its immediate valleys. Pelayo's cave became the first wound in imperial inevitability. Compostela turned that wound into a civilizational claim. By the time northern rulers were corresponding with the Carolingian world and shaping a frontier society built around permanent armed resilience, Covadonga had already grown larger than itself. It had become origin myth. That is why the title's dramatic arithmetic, 300 against 100,000, matters symbolically, even if the exact battlefield numbers remain uncertain in strict historical terms. The core truth does not depend on literal medieval exaggeration. What matters is that a force so small as to seem irrelevant used terrain, local knowledge, conviction, and the enemy's contempt to create a result the Empire did not believe possible. A great power entered the mountains, assuming it was performing cleanup. It left behind a defeat so psychologically awkward that it failed to respond decisively enough the next time. That hesitation gave Northern Christian resistance the time it needed to become state, frontier, and then historical movement. So what happened at Covadonga was not just bravery. The transcript is right to reject that easy word. Bravery alone cannot explain it. What happened was something colder and more structural. Pelayo understood that if he fought the empire where the empire was strong, he ceased to exist. So he found the one place where size, speed, and military reputation would rot into uselessness, and he forced the invader to come there. He turned a cave into a killing funnel, a mountain into artillery weather, into an ally, and desperation into a political beginning. The Umayyads still ruled most of Iberia afterward, but from that day forward, they ruled knowing that the far north contained not just rebels, but a surviving contradiction. A piece of the peninsula that had refused the logic of surrender, and by refusing it successfully once, had made future resistance imaginable. That is the real legacy of Covadonga. Not one isolated miracle, a precedent, a proof of concept. The day an empire discovered that there are landscapes where conquest becomes clumsy, where numbers become congestion, where arrogance becomes blindness, and where the men waiting in the dark are no longer trying to win elegantly. They are trying to remain alive long enough to become history. Pelayo did that. And because he did, the cave at Covadonga stopped being a hiding place and became a beginning.